Hello, Donovan Bigelow back with part 2 of infant development. I'm going to review some material by Robert Emda and his co-workers from a text called Early Parenting and Prevention of Disorder. These are the folks who probably are at the forefront of the idea that mental health can no longer simply be passively waiting for mental illness to come into our office and dealing with it from that point on. We have to be a little bit, they're suggesting, prescriptive. We have to intervene. We have to recognize that early intervention and prevention, following the medical model, is the only thing that makes sense if we now have the ability to do that in a productive, creative way, if we can intervene and make a significant difference in the life trajectory of our patients and their children. It seems it would be negligent not to. We'll get into the details of how therapeutically that would get done later, but that's the almost inevitable result of these discoveries that neurology and the latest developments in attachment theory are leading us to. One of the phrases they use is toxic stress, and I think that, and to quote Emda, refers to the biological consequences of exposure to stress and elevated cortisol that can have effects on brain development, that in turn can have downstream effects on a range of adaptive functions, including stress physiology, immune functions, learning, and ability to respond to future adversities. One influential population study carried out from an internal medicine lifespan perspective delineated the clear pathway from early adversity to later risk behaviors and then to poor health and poor educational achievement. It just doesn't seem in much dispute anymore that early intervention is necessary because there's a powerful correlational link. One is tempted to say causation here between the toxic stress of infant development derailment at some level and subsequent adolescent and adult mental illness. Emda also calls it the biology of adversity, early developmental origins of both educational failures and adult disease. The report also reviews how much we have learned about early inborn capacities and the extent to which brain growth relies on the necessary early experience that parenting interactions provide, confirming epigenetics and the idea that a loving environment actually directly results in more complex neuronal structures in the brain. Quote, other science has included the extent to which early experience dependent on parenting influences genetic action important for survival and adaptation. Since the human genome has been mapped, it has been said that some of the most dramatic findings at the molecular level are pointing to the importance of the environment for regulating genetic expression of relevance for health and disorder. Thus, the study of epigenetics, of how genes are expressed and regulated by specific environments, this is the frontier of current science. I think that is the most accurate description of this most important neurological discovery. Absolutely profound. Variation on a theme, but reinforcing. Many studies have shown that the attachment type is a central precursor of the social emotional behavior. Hence, a secure attachment type is a protective factor for a child's development. This assessment bears great significance for all forms of early and earliest prevention. As generally known, a mother's sensitivity, the most valuable instrument in developing a child's secure attachment behavior, is most fragile. As soon as a mother is affected by stress and tension, her empathic ability to relate to the inner condition of the infant is compromised, and in extreme cases even ceases to exist. This is central. This is absolutely central. If the mother's experience of her baby isn't allowed to be encouraged to be, almost required to be, evoking that primary maternal preoccupation, evoking that hormonal, biological tendency to narrow down on the baby's experience, to open her up to being activated by the baby's emotional stances, to be able to be this all-encompassing container for the baby. If that doesn't happen, if the mother is affected by stress, anxiety, toxic stress, environmental impingements, then what we have very quickly is the context of the baby's mind growing up without what it needs to grow up whole. And Emda and his colleagues mention something here that I think is essential, that goes back to the fatherhood issue. Tension between parents affects the way they handle the children, especially infants, in the sense of a spillover effect, sometimes leading to emotional inaccessibility, rejection, aggression, and hostility. I haven't done statistics on this, but I think in most of my patients' cases, in my clinical practice, and certainly the stories I hear from my students confirm this, that those with the most severe disorders remember acts of violence, remember acts of grotesque abandonment, remember when it's not quite so severe, certainly ugly, hostile arguments between their parents. They remember unpleasant, unhealthy, scary, dangerous, anxiety-drenched household atmosphere. And that's what they took in. And they come to my office in desperate need of working that through in the context of how they're repeating that pattern in their current relationships. I think Emda and his colleagues have nailed something here of profound significance. Okay, this last aspect is of major importance for our topic. Now, we're talking about situations in infancy where there is significant maltreatment or neglect. So, since maltreatment causes the child to retreat from the abusive caregiver and leaves it no longer willing to empathically understand the other person's feelings, abuse and other traumatizations affect the development of mentalization and reflection abilities. Also, the abuse of a child ensues the loss of resilient abilities, which are connected with the ability to understand interpersonal situations. Here's what I think this means. That severe neglect and or abuse of very young children generates downstream effects that make it almost impossible, at least without dramatic, intense, and long-term therapy, to connect with others in healthy ways. It is no accident that we call the intergenerational transmission of trauma the reality that mental illness seems to pass down generation to generation. But it's not genetic in the direct traditional way, the way blonde hair, blue eyes get transmitted genetically. The intergenerational transmission of trauma is the transmission of trauma as a taken-in emotional experience that has downstream effects on development, relational dynamics, the ability to think, the ability to be in healthy relationships, the ability to be a whole sense of yourself. Wow. The good news. Right? According to Fonagy and Target, mentalization and secure attachment result from successful containment during early socialization, infancy. Even though they are not one and the same, the ability to mentalize, I call that to think, is commonly found in empathic, securely attached mothers, but can also be found in traumatized mothers after successful psychotherapy. The ability to critically reflect their own disorganized attachment patterns enables these mothers to develop a, quote, earned secure attachment and break the transgenerative cycle of relaying their attachment type onto their children. This is the most hopeful part of this entire lecture, that there is no doom. There is no one so broke they can't be fixed to at least a significant degree. There is cause for hope, there is cause for courage, And the beauty of this is what science shows. This is not me being naively optimistic. This is not an ideology. This is not naive optimism here. This is science as best it can determine the course of mental development. I want to turn briefly to one of the things that Emda and his researchers came up with that was surprising, that I didn't see coming. The idea of resilience is a little like the idea of temperament. It's been assumed for decades that certain children just come into the world with certain kinds of temperaments. Likewise, they come in with a certain level of resilience. Some babies are just sensitive and vulnerable. Some babies are robust and resilient and seem to manage difficulty without much trouble. That turns out, apparently, not to be accurate. Longitudinal, long-term studies of adolescents in a spectrum of mental illness scenarios, mild to very severe, what they found was that if you look closely at their developmental history, the ones, though they appeared to have similar traumatic, difficult, neglectful, if abusive infancies, if you control for the infancy experience as best you can and compare apples to apples, you end up seeing a spectrum of different mental illness categories. That seems to suggest that biologically there's something different with the babies up front. That's not the case. Close research into the history of their developmental process shows that those adolescents who went through similar infant development phases of, at the very least, severe neglect, those who ended up resulting in the least severe mental illness, it was clearly identified that they had some source, some other individual that they attached to, that resiliency itself is earned, that it's subsequent to the childhood developmental neglect or derailment, and that each of these more adaptive adolescents, it turns out, got what they needed, if not from their mother and or father. They got it from somewhere, an older brother, an uncle, a neighbor, a coach. The creativity here is basically children get what they need from whoever is available to give it at some level. And so the idea of resilience is now, like the mind itself, more deeply intertwined with development than purely seen as a genetic background. All right, so I want to turn now to maybe the most important section of these lectures, and it's the hard neurological data. I'm going to focus on the works of a researcher named Alan Shore. I believe I can say that at the forefront of developmental neuroscience stands Alan Shore. He is the most prolific writer, the most prolific researcher. He has written more books, authored more articles, either independently or with others, and appears to be, at this time, the world's foremost authority on developmental neuroscience. He recognizes that there has been a decades-long revolution with at the core of which is the technology development of a variety, many different kinds of sophisticated scanning technologies that he has used, and others have, to actually explore the functioning of alive infant brains in the context of their relationship with their mothers, scanning the brains of the mothers while interacting with the babies. The data that is generated from these researches is profound, widespread, and forms the basis for at least tentative conclusions that are grounded in neurological science. He will also support the idea that the psychoanalytic researchers have come to separately, that mental illness is now without much question grounded in developmental derailment in infancy. In chapter 11 of Scharf's new book, using regulation theory to guide clinical assessments of mother-infant attachment relationships. He states, citing other research, Leckman and Marsh conclude that, quote, a scientific consensus is emerging that the origins of adult disease are often found among developmental and biological disruptions occurring in the early years of life. Others, quote, most mental illnesses begin far earlier in life than was previously believed. And this is where Shore is following parallel researchers by Emda and his colleagues, calling for early childhood policy and practice. They're calling for, I think, a revolution in what it means to be a psychotherapist. We are being called on by the neuroscientists to be proactive, prescriptive, intervening in the earliest phases of infant development, motherhood, pre-motherhood, to do psychological evaluations of those who wish to be parents, to give them guidance on how to be in the right mental space, to intervene aggressively with the children, the infants, in ways that go way beyond the therapist's traditional quiet and attentive listening. Quote, because development in infancy is occurring within the relational context of nonverbal, implicit, non-conscious infant caregiver attachment dynamics. All right, what he's saying is right brain, unconscious, emotional resonance, subverbal, not intellectual, not theoretical, not in language. Everything of importance that's happening between the baby and the mother is happening in the right brain. He's suggesting that therapists go down that road as well. Recent advances in developmental psychoanalysis and neuropsychoanalysis on the early relational development of the unconscious mind are supposed to be incorporated by therapists into their early interventions. He's suggesting directly that therapists need to change their focus. They need to change the focus not on their fancy theories and thoughts verbalized, not on their fancy interpretations, but on their own unconscious, resonant containment of emotional dynamics between their right brains and the patient's right brains. It's shifting pretty dramatically. There is one branch of psychology called emotion-focused therapy, and it's a fairly new discovery to me at least. And what I think they were onto something. They're not neurologically informed, as far as I can tell, looking at the emotion-focused therapy literature, but they seem to have found a parallel process to the human developmental mind that completely tracks, nicely tracks, what the neuroscientists are discovering. I think this appears to be the wave of the future in psychotherapy. More on that later. All right. Okay, let's get a little more specific. Shore comes up with some fairly specific prescriptive suggestions, some prescriptive explanations as to exactly how a mother's supposed to do this. Now, we can't get into the baby's brain. We can't really get into the mother's brain. It isn't like physics or chemistry or mathematics. There's still a bit of experiential or theoretical leap here. But we're getting as close as we've ever been. And Shore suggests that there's three primary ways the mothers interact with their babies in a way that facilitates and fosters this right brain, nonverbal, unconscious, emotional regulation way of being. The first, visual facial attachment communications. Traditionally, it's called gaze, and everyone's known this for a long time, but there's something about the gaze of the mother, there's something about the baby's gaze back that locks those two together in this amazing visual dance with each other. Now, There is a 5-minute video that I'm going to ask you to watch. If you're listening to this, you obviously have access to the internet. I don't know if I mentioned this right off the bat, but I think it's absolutely essential that anyone watching this to get an experiential to get an experience, an evocative experience, not just a theory, but an evocative experience of what I'm talking about. Go online and watch The Still Face Experiment by Dr. Edward Tronick, Tronick, The Still Face Experiment. It's just 5 minutes, and it is so visually powerful. It will evoke emotions in you that are well worth the opportunity. What he shows is the intense emotional response that a baby has to the visual connection of a mother and to the underlying emotional substrate that that visual gaze actually represents. The assumption is we must be visually attached to our babies. There is something, I'm going to call it genetic, evolutionary, biological, that the literature is explicit and clear about this. A baby must have consistent availability to the mother in this loving dance of visual back and forth. The baby desperately must have that to proceed developmentally, to proceed organically from the perspective of brain development. One of the things a mother has to do is be present to the baby sufficient to look at the baby when the baby wants to look back. The baby will turn away, and the mother then gets to. It's a dance that the mother has to be attuned to the baby's needs. The whole point of this exercise, as I think I mentioned before, is that the privileging of the baby's needs, and this work is about understanding what those needs are, is of necessity what good mothering is about, and in a parallel way, because it is parallel, what good therapy is about. What do the patients need? What do the baby needs? What are the needs of the baby? Really. Not what the adult patients say they need, but what do they need really? A baby can't say what they need, but they can tell an attuned mother. And the first way they do that is by a gaze. If the mother is present and available and can look and respond at an emotional level appropriate to the baby's pulling and hauling, all right, then development proceeds apace. All right, the quote to begin this was, "The self-organization of the developing brain occurs in the context of a relationship with another self, another brain." You can't get any clearer than that. Child-infant development is a connection between the right brain of the mother and the right brain of the baby. If that isn't connected, it's not going to work. All right. Once the mother understands that she's got to be healthy and whole and that there's got to be sufficient time on a continuing daily basis for that gaze response to happen with her newborn and recently born baby, what else does she do in addition to that? These aren't either or. They're all simultaneous. They're all going on, and they all must be focused on together. The second one is auditory prosodic attachment communications. All right? We have visual facial attachment communications, and now we have auditory prosodic attachment communications. We're communicating here at the neurological level. Auditory is obvious, verbal, but prosodic, what does that mean? That means not the content, but the process of the voice. Not what you're saying, but how you're saying it. The melody of the mother's music, okay? Technically, I suppose you could think that what the mother says is irrelevant to a week-old baby. You could say gibberish, nonsense. You could say terrible things, actually. I wouldn't recommend it. But the language doesn't matter. The content doesn't matter. What matters is the prosodic message the baby's taking in, the rhythm, the dance, the balance of the mother's emotional tonalities, okay? The contrast, the highs, the lows, the modulation of the mother's voice, all of those things. Infant speak, that's what that is. And worldwide, babies are attuned to mother's infant speak. It sounds a little like gibberish. It sounds like baby talk. And it turns out that's what babies want and need more than anything in the world. They will attune to that. It is developmentally necessary. Now, it is also necessary that the baby, at some point fairly soon in its development, begin to take in language. But the first, let's say, and again, hard and fast deadlines are things developmental psychologists used to lay down. We don't do that so much anymore. So it's hard to say when you should stop the baby talk and begin discussing and using language in adult form to babies. I think both can go on for a long time. You can read to your baby. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's quite useful. But it's also, and for a long time after birth, essential that the baby hear the mother's melody, the music of her voice, and that voice be directed at the baby. I think that's the key, that this is baby-directed speech, not just listening to the mother read a book, though that can be very important later for the child's acquisition of language, left brain things, which are also essential for the child's development, but we got to get first things first. And the first thing is visual gaze communication. The second is verbal language, auditory, prosodic attachment communication, infant-directed speech. And the third is tactile gestural attachment communications. All right. You gotta touch them. that there probably isn't anything as powerful as touch to the baby. I think this may be the central. Babies left in their cribs alone die. If you listen to the child development lectures, there's research that goes back to the Second World War in England called hospitalism was the syndrome, they labeled it, when babies were left alone, though they were well taken care of in terms of food, clothing, shelter, warmth, medical care, examinations, cleanliness, all of that. They were left in cribs and only attended to minimally for their physical needs alone. Half of them died in 6 months. They have to be held. Babies have to be touched. That is part of that resonant emotional connection necessary for brain development. And it manifests itself in the close, visceral feeling experience of being held, the tactile rocking motion, the feel of the nipple in the mouth, the molding of the baby's body to the mother's body. And what's also interesting is there's even some data that healthy mothers mostly hold their children on the left side. The speculative meaning of this is that, remember, the right side of the brain covers the left side of the body and vice versa in terms of nerve function. A baby on the left side is more intimately connected to the right side, the right brain of the mother, which is the emotional dominant side. There was some interesting, perhaps just slightly more than anecdotal data showing a significant increase in the percentage of mothers holding babies on the right side who were severely mentally disturbed themselves. It was like they were trying to intellectually connect to their babies because emotionally they couldn't, and the tendency was for them to hold babies on the right side. Fascinating little nuance, not entirely clear as to. Look, you can hold a baby on the right side if your left arm gets tired for a while. It doesn't mean you're mentally ill or a bad mother. I get it. These are tendencies that seem to hold true over time. Perhaps I should have warned about this up front. One of the 6 or 7, I think I'm on number 8 now, revolutions in psychology is that there are very few cases where anyone is entitled taking extreme statements. There is not hard data saying you should do it this way, and if you do it that way, it's a disastrous problem. There are strong guidelines now, but any extrapolation to extremes has to be avoided. We want to stay in the solid, data-based, scientifically supported middle ground. Just because I say healthy mothers generally hold their babies on the left side doesn't mean that if you ever hold your baby on the right side, you're not a good mother. Those kind of extrapolations seem to me to be motivated. And if you go down that road, please take a look at why you might be doing that, because nothing in the data, nothing in the science warrants extrapolating these things out. I'm only saying what the data shows. I am not suggesting, and I am advocating to avoid extrapolations to extremes in either direction. Okay. Let me go back and quote a little more. This is good stuff. In the course of these right brain to right brain transaction, the infant forms an internal working model of his or her attachment relationship with the primary caregiver, which is stored in right lateralized, nonverbal, implicit procedural memory. If I would have just used that sentence right off the bat, no one would have known what I'm talking about. But if I say it slowly, I think based on the background already, it makes sense. I hope. These interactive representations encode strategies of affect regulation and contain coping mechanisms for maintaining basic regulation and positive affect in the face of environmental challenge. What that means, I think, is that loving mothers who themselves are whole, laying down that affect regulatory capacity in the baby's right brain, evoke the genetic unfolding of neurological structure that lay down neurological pathways that enhance affect regulation. And it happens prior to the accessing of language. The adolescent and adult's ability to contain their emotions seems to be a direct function of their experience of the containing mother's mind, both at the emotional level and now seeming at the genetic/neurological level. He goes on, at the most fundamental level, attachment represents the biological connection between the infant and mother. What is learned in emotionally laden attachment transactions and imprinted into the emotional right brain is stored not in conscious verbal declarative memory, but in non-conscious implicit procedural memory, where biologically wired instincts are interacting with the lived experience embedded in the primary caregiver-infant bodily based nonverbal relationship. It is this implicit nonverbal world that the clinician is accessing and assessing. Wow. Some scanning research. In the structural MRI study of the human brain from birth to age 2, Nick Meyer and others report, quote, total brain volume increased 101% in the first year with a 15% increase in the second. The volume of the subcortical area, including brainstem, increased by 130% in the first year and by 14% in the second year. The brain doubles in volume in the first year. The developmental stage of infancy, then, is a critical period for both cortical and subcortical brain development. We know that this growth is not just genetically encoded. Rather, it is epigenetically influenced and requires human interaction. Both variations in maternal caregiving and caregiver maltreatment are now seen as epigenetic modifications that regulate gene activity in the developing brain. This means that the quality of the primary attachment experience affects synaptogenesis and brain volume. That means love makes your brain grow. That means literally the scans have shown a loving maternal environment, well contained by a containing mother, is dramatically evocative of both a larger, more voluminous brain and synaptogenesis. The connection between individual neurons is shown to be more complex, many more connections being made, and many more layers of connections being made from the brain stem to the front of the brain. Astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. There is now agreement that, quote, the emotional experiences of the infant are disproportionately stored and processed in the right hemisphere during formative stages of brain ontogeny. That means brain growth. This means that the experiences the infant has in his or her interactions with the primary caregiver over early critical periods of attachment specifically affect the development of the right hemisphere, which is known to be the foundation for self-development. That's the key. That your sense of self, identity, who you are, who you feel yourself to be, the level of integration and wholeness, the level of strength, the ability to regulate emotional dynamics in the face of difficulty gets laid down at this time, again, prior to any verbal development, any linguistic left brain development. The importance of this, I do not think, can be overstated. One last. Attachment studies strongly support Pankap's bold assertion that the primacy of affective neuroscience, quote, now cognitive science must relearn that ancient emotional systems have a power that is quite independent of neocortical cognitive processes, unquote. In other words, what is learned cognitively and stored in the left hemisphere has little to do with the affective, relational, two-person experiences stored in the right hemisphere. Clinicians can only assess these patterns through their own implicit right brain connections with their clients. That is, by accessing their own bodily-based instinctive responses. Okay. The maternal, attuned, nonverbal communications needed to optimally facilitate the early development of the infant's right hemisphere require that the caregiver be able to implicitly and intuitively use her own right hemisphere and her own instincts in the service of co-creating the attachment bond. I hope I've made that clear enough now. The idea that we have hard neurological science facilitating an awareness of how emotions get processed, how a self develops, and gives us, I think, at least the opening to suggest prescriptive, proactive, interventionist recommendations that still are required to be attuned right brain to right brain between patients and clinicians. And what I'm suggesting here to those listening to this is that if you're going to make a difference in someone else's life, You can't just argue the theory of neonatal development. You're going to have to make an emotional, intuitive, resonant connection with that person before any of the theoretical stuff will have any persuasive ability at all. That this isn't about an argument, it's about the evocation of an internal experience of humanly connected truth and what's necessary to deepen and broaden that. I think that's the strongest take-home lesson here. The idea that our relationships can now be seen as potentially dramatically different than they've ever been. When you're in a relationship of any intimacy at all, fine, if you want to, you know what, I think, I don't want to go to extremes here, but I think you might be able to suggest that any human connectedness, any human relationship, no matter its level of professional, if it has nothing but attributes of a professional connection, an employee-employer, what you must look at a little more closely is the inevitable reenactment of both sides' affective, emotional, intuitive connectedness. A great boss knows his people. A great boss knows her colleagues' way of being and can act not just with verbal directions to get things done in the outside world, but with this intuitive ability to know how to move, how to manage your folks, to get things done efficiently and effectively. All human relationships have an element of intuitive right brain attachment dynamics. We bring it with us in an accumulated way, and we reenact, for good or ill, in all of our adult relationships, all of them, the dynamic that got laid down in our childhood. We come to therapy with the hope that those dynamics can be modified. The suggestion is they can be, but only if there's an attuned, emotional, resonant, containing experience of the therapist's mind. As an aside, and I don't think this is an aside, this absolutely confirms Freud's hard rule called the second fundamental rule, actually created by Ferenczi but adopted by Freud, that the analyst or the therapist, him or herself, must be analyzed to rock bottom. You can never take a patient deeper than you've been willing to go yourself. That's absolutely true. But now we understand how to do that and why serious analytic training institutes require their candidates to undergo a personal analysis 4 or 5 days a week for potentially several years until they've gone that deep. What's happening in an analysis is enough time, in enough of a context, to be able to connect at a profound emotional level, well beyond and much deeper than any simple, verbal, intellectual, language-based interpretive interaction, which it turns out are almost completely useless to structure meaningful change internally. This is why good teachers tell stories. This is why good teachers evoke in their patients, with their clinical material and the power of their emotional presence, things in the student's emotional life that come to conscious awareness in the process of the teaching and the learning and the back and forth between the students. It's why teachers in front of 300 students in large auditoriums reading from their notebooks are really, really bad teachers. They're just providing data which you can pick up anywhere. My hope is that you're listening to this lecture is evoking something at an emotional level in you that is resonant and feels important, feels true, feels like a connection to yourself, helps you understand the felt connection to others around you. If that's how you're responding to this material, then I am successful. If you think all this is just another foolish psychology theory, then you have missed the point entirely. Okay, let's move on a little to Dr. Michael Rudder and his summary of the qualities of mothering. We talked about gaze interaction, voice modulation, and touch. Dr. Rudder lays out 6 or 7 things that, and some other minor ones, 6 or 7 main things, that can be looked at as, and I don't want to do this directly, I don't want to do this in some concrete way, but these are a kind of checklist to see how you're doing. Maybe, and just even to use that language makes me nervous. Let's go through what he's suggesting here, walk you through the meaning of it, and see what's evoked. First, we have a quote from Bowlby, a brief one. Thus, in 1951, Bowlby concluded that, quote, mother love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. That just seems profoundly true to me. Bion said something similar 20 or 30 years later. He said that the truth to the mind is like food to the body, and that lies to the mind are like poison to the body. I think these metaphors have a literal truth to them that is profound. Bowlby has gone so far as to suggest that individuals suffering from any type of psychiatric disorder always show an impairment of the capacity for affectional bonding, and that frequently it is a disturbance of bonding in childhood which has caused the later psychiatric disorder. That's the direction everyone seems to be heading, that virtually every mental illness in adolescence and adult has its source in some kind of developmental derailment in infancy. And that's going to evoke anxiety in a lot of people. And let me reiterate now Winnicott's idea of the good enough mother. What I am challenging you to do here is not be the perfect mother or father. That isn't possible. We're human. We make mistakes. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's some good arguments that that's necessary for development too. But the good enough mother, as a theoretical formulation, is the idea that we meet virtually all the legitimate and meaningful needs of the child in a good enough way, not in a perfect way, but in a good enough way. It's still a very high standard. It still means you meet most of them most of the time in a good enough way. It's a very hard standard to meet. It doesn't give you license to slack or to not care or to take a vacation or to blow off your parenting duties. Oh, Winnicott said all I had to be is good enough. Fine. See you next Thursday. That's not how this works. So, in the context of understanding that, what are the elements that Dr. Michael Rudder suggests represent the qualities of mothering? The first, fairly obvious, a loving relationship. Primarily a mother's love, but also a warm atmosphere in the home among all. I think this is central. I think there's now neurological data that suggests Ella Freeman Sharp was probably right in the 1920s. I describe her work in one of the first child development videos, that it is the atmosphere in the home that the child takes in. I don't think she understood it neurologically, but she's right. The atmosphere in the home is the mother's mind and the father's mind. That is what causes the atmosphere in the home. A child takes in a loving relationship with the mother. But in addition, the child takes in as the format for a loving relationship, the loving relationship between the mother and father. If there is no loving relationship for the child to take in, it has a defective model for actualizing a loving relationship in adolescence and adulthood. There has to be some model of effective, loving, nurturing, emotionally attuned care that the child can take in. It's not just the loving relationship between the mother and the child, though that remains profoundly important and perhaps central. What I think Rudder is suggesting here is that expand that relationship and suggest that for full development, for complete and healthy development, the child takes in not just the mother's loving relationship, but an atmosphere in the home of relationships among others. Now, I think that this is the tie-in to the Oedipus complex. Melanie Klein backed up Freud's Oedipus complex, Freud having suggested its occurrence between 3.5 and 5 years. Klein backed it up to 6 months. She's right that something was going on relationally between the mother and father and the child much earlier than Freud understood. We're now suspicious that it goes back even farther and may be a dynamic from birth and even before. Getting the data on this is a little complicated. But in Rudder's research, this would all make sense now. The Oedipus complex isn't an intellectual dynamic. It isn't a thought. It's a feeling state that is about love between the mother and father, perhaps feelings of being left out by the child, competition with the mother and or the father, depending on the gender, and the struggle of the infant to make sense of that, to work that through, to manage that. And that's done by internalizing the loving relationship between the parents. The theoretical leap here, the profound theoretical leap, is that the resolution of the Oedipus complex in the child of age 5 or 6, which remains the absolute essential gateway to adult healthy functioning, has its beginnings in the child's taking in of a loving relationship between the parents. If that happens, good things happen. If it doesn't happen, the child is left with a developmental deficit from the beginning, and something bad is going to happen. The child has to have the example of a loving relationship, not just with the mother. Okay. Number 2, attachment. Parallel to the first one, the good, loving relationship has to be with the mother, but attachment, again, is seen in slightly broader terms. It's clear that a baby can be attached to the father. Now, the attachment is different. The tone is different. A male's energy, a father's energy, is different than a mother's energy. And I think that's a legitimate difference. Vive la différence. It's not the same, but it's going to be necessary for the child to be connected to more than one person if the child's going to grow up healthy. I think that's clear. We can focus too much on the mother. There will be inevitably, because in terms of at least evolutionary expectation, we are a tribal creature and all babies have always grown up surrounded by others, and I think that's a developmental necessity. Okay, back to the mother and child. However, attachment must be to one person, primarily. And Rudder suggests, and I quote, the same person must have contact with the child over a prolonged period on the grounds that attachments take time to develop. At least above a certain level, the absolute amount of time spent in the company of the child does not seem to affect the development of attachment, but the intensity of the parental interaction with the child probably is important. Mothers who play with their child and give him a great deal of attention have a more strongly attached child than those who interact with the child only when giving routine care. Similarly, when a relatively unstimulating mother is found in conjunction with an extremely attentive father, the latter is likely to head the infant's hierarchy of attachment objects despite the mother's greater availability. All right, let me unpack this. There's a lot of stuff here. The first idea is that, the first idea puts to rest, I think permanently, the delusion from the 1970s that parents could shift to quality time. There is no such thing as quality time as a substitute for the present emotionally attached mother for the vast majority of the child's waking experience from birth to 2 or 3 years old. It is not the same. Oh, I can put the child in daycare, I can put the infant in daycare, and I'll just spend a couple of hours of really good time with the child when I get home from work, whenever that is. That turns out to be neurologically destructive. That turns out to be emotionally derailing. The literature is clear about this. There is no way to rationalize the suffering the child gets inflicted on it when thrown into daycare, nurseries, infant nurseries especially, prior to at least 2 years, and some literature suggests 3. Their minds are not capable of that kind of tearing apart experience, which is what happens when attachment isn't securely achieved by the long-term committed connection of one loving, present, emotionally attuned mother figure. If you do that, then the child can more comfortably and without trauma be away from the child for extended periods. But it looks like, at the very minimum, the first 2 years, but I think better safe than sorry the first 3, for attachment to happen and for the child's needs to be met, that connection to a single mothering person among the other lesser connections is a necessity. Part 3. The third thing, an unbroken relationship. Now, this is reinforcing number 2, the attachment. In order to achieve the meaning of attachment, that attuned presence, that taking in of the mother's capable mind by the baby, the nature of the relationship must have continuity. There will always be transient separations. Mother's got to get some sleep, a mother's got to take a shower, a mother's got to get a break. That's absolutely legitimate, reasonable, no doubt about that. Don't take this to an extreme. Those short-term separations are healthy for everyone. But by and large, what we're describing here, what the literature is consistently suggesting, is that continuity of the primary relationship is essential. Number 4, a stimulating interaction. It is not just about being there. You've got to be there in a particular way. And this is where I think both the mother's prosodic language, how the mother speaks to the child, how they interact, both physically in terms of contact, gaze reaction, and all the other things the mother does in the visual proximity of the baby. I will add to this part now, the stimulation of what they do and where they go and what they see and what's evoked in the baby's curiosity. A baby cannot be curious simultaneously with being afraid. In the brain, 2 primary systems, attachment and defense. You can't activate them at the same time. If a baby's afraid, they don't have curiosity sufficient to explore the world. This is a profound insight. Okay? So stimulating environments have to have as a precursor the emotionally attuned mother who is containing enough to make the baby feel safe. Secure attachment makes the baby feel safe. They get curious then. They're not afraid of things. They're not filled with rage, fear, anxiety, envy, and blotting out their ability to test reality. They're containing their emotions and therefore have the leisure to practice a naturally evoked curiosity about the world. This is where I think the first opportunity comes in for a mother to begin an enriched experience, using more complex language, using readings, using visuals, cues, and visual experiences for the child, along with all of the others. My advice to mothers at the early stages is kill your iPhone, kill your television, and keep all babies away from video screens of any kind ever, no exceptions. Feeling a little intense about this. You can't turn video screens of any kind into babysitters. It blots out the baby's mind. A video screen is anathema, is the opposite of what any young child needs. There is nothing stimulating about a video screen. There's nothing interactive about it. It requires a mindlessness, a passivity that has no interactive element that numbs the growth of a baby's, an infant, a toddler's mind. I think it numbs the growth of an adolescent or adult mind in exactly the same way. That may be my prejudice. Okay, stimulating interaction, number 4. Number 5, relationship with one person. Sounding familiar? Maybe he's getting a little redundant here. I think he might be. But he's hammering home a point that I think has to be made. And I think in this, he's also increasing the awareness of mother surrogates, as well as others in the family and other extended members and friends. I think what he's arguing here directly is that mother surrogates are a problem. If there isn't one person, then what is being attached to by the baby is like the foundation of a building. It's building up a particular type of building that's unique to this unique attachment relationship. If the baby gets handed off to somebody else for an extended period of time, then we have a very different person with a very different mind projecting into the baby very different emotional experiences. And the baby has to start over with a new foundation. And then another, and then another, and all of a sudden, you've got foundations and no built-up mind in this baby's psyche. This is developmental derailment. So again, other people in the baby's life is a good thing. The focus has to be on a relationship, a primary relationship with one person over the course of the first 2 or 3 years of the baby's life. The 6th primary thing is mothering in the child's own home. I think, frankly, that this is a bit of an angular swipe at any sort of institutionalized care. John Bowlby said, and I quote, "Children thrive better in bad homes than in good institutions, and that a residential nursery cannot provide a satisfactory environment for infants and young children. Period. Infants and young children cannot have their fundamental needs met in any kind of institution, nurseries, or daycare kind of warehouses. All right? It doesn't work. That's the data. Deal with it as best you can. Mothering in the child's own home is the only way all of the child's fundamental needs get met, really. Now, those are the 6th primary things. Let me review briefly. A loving relationship, in addition to a loving relationship in the home with the wife and father, the mother and father. Attachment, in the technical meaning of that now. An unbroken relationship, a stimulating interaction, a relationship with one person primarily, and in the child's own home consistently. In addition, several minor factors that would make up the quality of mothering. Care and protection. The child must be protected from an impinging reality. The child has to be protected in this day and age from stimulation that's dangerous or dangers that can derail development. The dangers in the modern environment are almost unnumberable. Food. Food, obviously, but we are lousy at helping our babies and infants and toddlers eat well. We are lousy at doing that ourselves. There have been several developmental psychology studies of infant, toddler, and young child eating habits, and the direction it is heading is disastrous. absolutely disastrous. Children, babies, toddlers have to eat well. Babies need breast milk from their mother. They need to feed at the breast. The data on this is unmistakable. Breastfed babies do better across the board, not just because nutritionally it is the ideal food for babies, genetically and evolutionarily speaking, or maybe God's gift to the baby, take your pick. The alternative nutritionally is simply unsound, on top of the emotional, tactile attachment connection that breastfeeding means, which we now see as a central part of the baby's growing mind. Feeding isn't just about food. It inevitably has a component of attachment to it, of right brain to right brain emotional dynamics, on top of the fact that parents are notoriously bad at feeding their children appropriately. Relationships to both parents are essential. Play and toys. Time playing seems like a silly little thing. It turns out it's really important. Stimulating toys. Safe toys, obviously, but stimulating ones nonetheless, and time for the mother and the baby and others to spend time playing, because that turns out to be a developmental necessity for the child. The child is working at play. The child is trying on fantasies. The child is exploring their world with curiosity. If they're not, something's wrong. If they're not giving the opportunity to do that, something's wrong with the parenting. Parent-child communications and language development. This is a more advanced idea. Yes, at some point, it's essential that the child be exposed to adult language. It is clear that this is a critical period issue. If children aren't exposed to language early and frequently and consistently, it very often happens that they become linguistically delayed, developmentally delayed around the use of language, and it's very difficult. In fact, some would say this is one of those things where the critical period idea actually holds true, that if you don't get this adequate in the time that the baby is acquiring language, you're not going to be able to make up for this later. There will always be some kind of speech impediment. There will always be some kind of language problem in the young adult and adult. So, read to your child. Read to them frequently. At this point, I think it's time to take another short break, and we will move into the third hour of infant development. Thank you very much.